Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Science by Nemvita. Whether you're listening at the end of a long day or simply letting your thoughts slow down, this is a place where curiosity unfolds gently. There's nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember, and nothing you need to focus on. If you notice your attention drifting, that's perfectly fine. Here, we explore one quiet idea at a time, slowly and softly. Let the words become a calm background, and let your body settle into rest. Allow your breathing to soften, slow down, and become quiet, steady, and easy. I'm glad you're here. There is a particular quality to the way things return to themselves. Not suddenly, not with announcement, but in the way that a stone path after rain gradually reveals its own color again, as the water settles into the earth and the surface lightens, slowly, without anyone asking it to. Healing has that quality. It belongs to the category of things that do not ask to be watched. This is, perhaps, the most important thing that can be said about it at the beginning. Not that it is powerful, though it is. Not that it is complex, though it is that too. But simply that it doesn't require attention to proceed. It asks for nothing from the part of you that thinks and worries and keeps count. It requires only time and the absence of interference and the ordinary passage of one moment into the next. We tend, as people, to notice the moments of breaking, the cut, the bruise, the crack, the loss, the ragged edge of something that was whole. These moments are sharp, they register, they announce themselves. And because we notice them so clearly, we often build our understanding of healing around those announcements, as if healing were simply the story of what happens after the dramatic moment. As if it were the second chapter in a story that only begins with injury. But restoration is far older than injury. The body does not begin to understand repair only when something goes wrong. It has been practicing its understanding of wholeness since before there was anything to break. The mechanisms that close a wound are the same mechanisms that quietly, constantly, maintain the tissue that will never be wounded at all. The language of repair is spoken all the time, not only in emergencies. It is a background conversation, ongoing, steady, the kind that does not need to pause and resume, but simply continues, like the sound of water moving somewhere in a building you have lived in long enough to stop noticing. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that repair is not a response to damage so much as it is a fundamental condition of living tissue. That the body is not merely capable of healing, but is constituted by healing, organized around it, built from the ongoing practice of it. Every structure in a living body is the result of accumulated restoration. Every cell that exists today replaced one that came before it, and was itself shaped by a process of formation that is, at its deepest level, indistinguishable from the process of repair. When a forest is described as old, what is meant, in part, is that it has survived many cycles of loss and return. Trees that fell decades ago have become the ground that younger trees now grow from. Fungi have carried minerals from places of abundance to places of need. Rain has carved small channels that redirect water toward roots. The old forest did not remain old by staying the same. It remained old by continuously becoming itself again through processes that look, from the outside, like stillness. There is a lesson in that, though it is not the kind of lesson that needs to be applied or acted upon. It is more the kind of lesson that simply sits alongside you as you breathe, as you let your shoulders settle, as you feel the weight of the evening collecting in your limbs. The body, like the forest, like the riverbed, like the soil beneath the field after a long winter, operates on a time scale that doesn't match the one we use for most of our daily lives. We tend to measure our days in appointments and hours, in tasks completed and tasks deferred. But the body measures time differently. It measures time in the slow thickening of a scar, in the gradual mineralization of bone around a fracture, in the way a bruise moves through its colors before it disappears. These are longer rhythms, quieter rhythms. They proceed regardless of what the clock says. And there is something calming about that, if you let it be. The thought that somewhere beneath whatever you are carrying tonight, beneath the accumulated weight of the day and the week and the months before it, there is a rhythm that simply continues. That has always continued. That does not require your participation to keep going. The repairs are proceeding. The maintenance is ongoing. The quiet work of biological continuation is underway right now, without effort or intention from the thinking part of you. It is easy to forget this. The world outside is structured around visibility, around demonstration, around the things that can be shown and measured and announced. Healing does not fit comfortably in that structure. It tends to happen in the parts of experience that are least visible, in the hours of sleep, in the spaces between thoughts, in the interior dark of the body where there is no light to observe by and no language to describe what is occurring. The cells that rebuild do not report their progress. The collagen laid down in a healing wound does not send a signal to conscious experience to say, "This much now." It simply proceeds. And perhaps this is where healing has always lived. Not in the dramatic gestures of medicine, though medicine has its genuine place. Not in the moments of crisis and intervention, important as those moments are. But in the vast, unhurried, essentially invisible space between those moments, where the ordinary work of restoration takes place. In the night, in the quiet, in the slow accumulation of one repaired cell after another, one day added to another, until what was broken has become, simply, part of the history of the thing, and the thing itself continues on. Nature has been doing this far longer than any human understanding of it. Long before anyone had a name for collagen, skin was knitting itself closed. Long before anyone understood the chemistry of bone repair, fractured limbs were slowly finding their strength again. Long before the word healing existed in any language, rivers were reshaping their banks. Forests were regrowing after fires. The soil was rebuilding its capacity to hold water and support roots, season after unhurried season. There is something in this to lean against, something steady in the knowledge that restoration is not an invention, not a technology, not even a strategy. It is a feature of living systems so deep and so old that it preceded consciousness itself. The body does not heal because we figured out how to make it. The body heals because that is the nature of living bodies. It is what they do. It is, in a sense, what they are. Tonight, in the hours ahead, that process will continue in you as it continues in every living thing. Quietly, without announcement, without effort, in the darkness that gathers around you now. The repairs that need to happen will happen. The rebuilding that is underway will continue. and none of it requires your attention or your help or even your awareness. You can simply rest. You can let the quiet work proceed on its own, as it always has, as it was always going to, in the dark, in the slow, unhurried way that restoration has always moved through the world. There is nothing urgent in any of this. There is no timeline being missed, no threshold being approached too slowly. Healing has no deadline. It simply continues in the direction of wholeness at the pace that wholeness requires through all the hours that are given to it. And the hours given to it are many, more than we tend to realize, more, perhaps, than we tend to allow ourselves to believe. Somewhere beneath the surface of the skin, something is already being repaired that you will never know was broken. This is not a metaphor. It is the ordinary condition of living tissue. At any given moment, in any part of the body, there are structures being gently dismantled and rebuilt, surfaces being renewed, small imbalances being corrected by processes so fine and so constant that they produce no sensation, generate no awareness, and ask nothing of the mind that is, right now, beginning to loosen its grip on the day. The skin is the easiest place to begin because it is the part of the body we most associate with boundary. It is the edge of ourselves, the surface where we meet the world. And it is, in a way that rewards slow attention, one of the most quietly industrious parts of the body, not only in the aftermath of a wound, but always. Right now, in the skin across your hands, your arms, the soles of your feet, cells are moving upward through layers the way sediment moves slowly toward the surface of still water. The deepest layer produces new cells continuously. Those cells push the older ones upward, slowly, over the course of weeks. By the time a skin cell reaches the outermost surface, it has changed its nature entirely. It has become something harder, flatter, a kind of quiet armor. And then it releases, imperceptibly, and is replaced by the one that followed it upward. And that one is replaced by another in a cycle that doesn't stop while you are alive. You are not the same surface you were a month ago. The boundary of you has been entirely remade, so gradually that it never felt like change at all. When a wound does occur, this process is redirected with a kind of unhurried precision. The body does not panic. There is activity, certainly. There is a sequence of events that unfolds with purpose, but the nature of that purpose is patient. It moves in stages, each one preparing the conditions for the next. First, the blood is called to stop flowing outward. It thickens at the site, building a temporary bridge across the gap, a seal made of the body's own material. This takes only minutes, but the work that follows takes far longer, and it is in that longer work that the quality of healing most clearly shows itself. Eventually become the foundation for new tissue. This scaffolding is not permanent. It is a temporary architecture, built to be replaced by something stronger as the weeks continue. And as it is replaced, the tissue it supports becomes more organized, more aligned with the direction of strain, more capable of bearing the ordinary pressures of a life in motion. The scar that eventually forms is not a failure of the process. It is the signature of it, proof that something took place, that the body committed to its work, that the long, quiet effort of repair reached a conclusion of its own. All of this happens below the threshold of experience. You may feel the early stages, the heat and tenderness that signal activity, but the deeper phases, the rebuilding, the organization, the slow strengthening, these are felt, if at all, only as a gradual absence of discomfort. You do not feel yourself healing. You simply notice, one day, that you are more whole than you were. The bones carry this same quality of hidden continuity, though their timescale is longer and their language is one of mineral and weight. A bone that has fractured is remarkable to consider. In the hours after the break, blood fills the space, and the body begins a response that will last not days but months. A soft callus forms first, flexible and temporary, a kind of living splint made from the body's own material. It holds the pieces in approximate relationship, while the more permanent work begins. Gradually, over weeks, that soft material is replaced by harder tissue, then by true bone, and the tissue at the site begins to reorganize itself along the lines of mechanical stress, finding the orientation that will make it strongest for the particular forces that will pass through it for the rest of its life. A healed fracture is often, at the microscopic level, denser and more organized than the original bone was at that site. Not always, and not in every circumstance, but often enough that it points toward something worth noticing. The process of repair does not merely return the structure to what it was, it refines it. It takes the information of the injury, the precise location of the weakness, the specific direction of the failure, and uses that information to build something more suited to the pressures it will face. Healing, in bone, is a kind of learning. And this learning continues throughout life, independent of injury. The bones are in constant conversation with the body they support. Cells that sense pressure signal cells that build, and cells that dissolve. The result is a skeleton that is continuously being revised in response to the actual demands being placed on it. Density accumulates where it is needed. Mass is withdrawn from areas that carry less load. The whole system is perpetually adjusting, perpetually correcting its own previous estimates of what is required. This is not a process we direct. It happens in the background of every hour, in the deep interior of every bone, without consultation with the thinking mind. The blood itself participates in all of this, and in much more. It is easy to think of blood as a transport system, as the means by which oxygen reaches tissue and waste is carried away. And it is that. But it is also something more layered, more conversational. The blood carries signals, it carries instructions, it carries information about conditions in one part of the body to cells in another part that need to know. When tissue is damaged, the damaged cells release molecules into the bloodstream that travel to distant locations, recruiting support, announcing need, directing resources towards the site of repair. The bloodstream, in this sense, is less like a highway and more like a community, a place where messages move in all directions and where the health of each part depends on the information flowing from every other part. And this community never stops its conversation. It is awake through every hour you are asleep, maintaining its correspondence, adjusting its responses, carrying forward the work that the waking hours began and the sleeping hours complete. The cells that repair and rebuild are not less active at night. In many tissues, they are more active, freed from the demands of movement and digestion, and the 1,000 small responses that waking life requires. The hours of sleep are, for much of the body, the hours of greatest industry. The quiet that settles over the thinking mind doesn't settle over the tissues. For them, the night is simply a different kind of day. There are particular cells whose entire existence is devoted to the work of repair. They live in the deepest layers of tissues, in a state of quiet readiness, waiting for a signal that their particular skill is needed. When that signal arrives, they change, they divide, they move toward the site of need with a kind of purposeful migration that does not require direction from any central command. They seem to know where to go. They follow chemical gradients the way water follows the slope of the land, moving always toward the place where the concentration is highest, toward the site of need, through the dark interior of the body. Without light or guidance beyond the chemistry they can sense around them. This movement, this purposeful migration of cells through tissue, is one of the things that happens right now, in you, as your breathing slows and your eyes lose their interest in the light. The body you inhabit is not resting in the way that a machine rests, by simply stopping. It is resting in the way that a forest rests at night, with all its quieter processes still in motion, its fungi still exchanging minerals through the dark soil, its roots still drawing water upward through the still hours, its smallest living things still going about their work in the absence of the sun. You are, in these hours, more like a forest than like a machine, and it is worth letting that settle to whatever depth it wants to reach, as the night continues around you and the quiet work proceeds beneath the surface of everything you can feel. The body has been practicing this work for as long as there have been bodies. Every mechanism involved in the repairs that are happening right now has been refined over an almost incomprehensible span of time, tested against every condition that living things have faced, adjusted and preserved and passed forward through every generation that preceded you. The cells that migrate toward damage in your tissue are following paths that were established long before any memory exists of them being established. They do not know their history, but their history is present in everything they do. And all of it, every cell, every signal, every quiet migration through the dark interior of tissue, all of it is proceeding right now without urgency, without rush, without the sense that something needs to be finished before morning. The body's repairs do not have a deadline. They have a direction. And that direction is always, quietly, toward continuation. Moves through the hours until the light moves through the hours until the light returns. And the body is, once again, a little more whole than it was before. There is a hillside somewhere that burned a long time ago. You would not know it now if you stood at the edge of it in the early morning with the light coming sideways through the trees. The trees are there again. Not the same trees, not the same individuals that stood in that place before the fire moved through, but trees, genuinely, fully. Trees with deep roots and canopies wide enough to hold birds and shade, and the slow dripping of rain long after the rain has stopped. The hillside has returned to something that, from a certain distance, looks identical to what it was. And in many of the ways that matter most to the living things that inhabit it, it is. This return did not happen quickly. It did not happen through any single event or any single season. It happened the way that almost all natural restoration happens, through a sequence of small arrivals, each one preparing the conditions for the next, each one making the place slightly more habitable for something that could not have survived there before. In the first months after the fire, the burned ground was not empty. It was occupied by a different kind of life. Plants that thrive in disturbed soil, plants whose seeds require heat to open, plants that are specialists in beginning, moved in first. Their roots began the work of holding the soil together, of drawing minerals upward, of adding organic material as they lived and died through the seasons. And then, gradually, the plants that prefer some shade arrived, finding shelter behind the pioneers. And then the shrubs, and then the young trees, moving upward through the decades toward the canopy, while below them the soil was being rebuilt by fungi and by the slow decomposition of every plant that had lived and died in that place since the burning. The soil that exists under a mature forest is not simply dirt. It is decades of accumulated biological work, layers of decomposed material, networks of fungal thread connecting the roots of trees across distances of many meters, an entire invisible community of organisms whose activity produces the conditions that the visible forest depends on. The forest did not restore itself. That is not quite the right way to say it. What happened was more like this. The place continued being a place, and life continued doing what life does in any available place. And over time, the accumulation of all that living and dying and exchanging and breaking down and building up produced something that resembled, in its overall character, what had been there before. Not by intending to, not by following a plan, but by following the only direction that living systems know, which is toward greater complexity, toward greater connection, toward the elaboration of more and more intricate relationships between more and more kinds of living things. This is restoration in its most natural form, not a return to a fixed original state, because that state no longer exists and the conditions that produced it have changed, but a movement toward a kind of equilibrium, toward the particular configuration that this place, with its specific soil and slope and rainfall and temperature, tends to organize itself around when given enough time and enough quiet. Rivers carry this same quality, though their timescale is different and their language is one of water and stone rather than root and soil. A river that has been altered, its channel redirected, its banks reshaped by some sudden change in the landscape, does not simply accept its new form and remain in it. It works against it, gently, persistently, without urgency. Water moving over a surface finds the path of least resistance, and in finding it, it slowly modifies that path. A slight curve in a channel becomes, over years, a more pronounced curve, as the water on the outside of the bend erodes the bank and deposits its material on the inside. The curve becomes a bend. The bend becomes a meander. The meander eventually cuts off into an oxbow lake, a quiet crescent of still water beside the river that formed it, and the river itself has moved on, settling into a new course that is, in its overall form, similar to the one it held before. This process has no destination in mind. The river does not intend to restore its original path. It simply moves according to the physics of water and the geography of the land. And the result, over time, is a form that belongs to that place, that fits the particular contours of that particular valley, that expresses in its curves and cut banks and gravel bars the accumulated history of all the water that has passed through it. And there is something in that worth holding gently as the night continues. The idea that restoration does not require intention, that the movement toward a kind of wholeness is built into living systems at a level deeper than purpose, deeper than plan. The river does not decide to reshape itself. The forest does not decide to return. The soil does not decide to rebuild its community of organisms. These things happen because the conditions that allow them to happen exist, and because the processes involved follow their own internal logic, faithfully, without interruption, across whatever span of time is required. The soil is perhaps the slowest and most patient of all these restoring systems. Good agricultural soil, the kind that has accumulated over centuries in an undisturbed meadow or a mature forest floor, represents an extraordinary density of biological activity. A single teaspoon of healthy soil contains more organisms than there are people on the earth. These organisms, bacteria, fungi, microscopic animals, the early larval forms of larger creatures, are all in constant relationship with one another and with the mineral particles and decaying organic material around them. They break down complex molecules into simpler ones. They transform one element into another form that plants can use. They create the physical structure of the soil itself, the tiny channels and aggregates that allow it to hold water and air in the proportions that plant roots require. When this community is disrupted, when the living network of the soil is damaged or removed, the soil loses much of its capacity to support life. It becomes something more like substrate, like ground, like surface. It does not immediately appear different, but the absence of its living community means that the processes it once carried out are no longer occurring, and the things that depended on those processes begin to reflect that absence. Restoration of the soil is among the slowest of all natural processes. Building a centimeter of true topsoil, the kind with a developed biological community and the right structural properties, can take decades, or in some conditions, centuries. It cannot be rushed. The organisms that constitute a healthy soil community do not accelerate their work in response to urgency. They proceed at the pace that their biology permits, which is the pace that has been adequate to the task for as long as soil has existed, which is to say, for a very long time. And this patience, this absolute indifference to human timescales, is not a limitation. It is a kind of faithfulness. The soil rebuilds itself at the pace it has always rebuilt itself, through every previous disruption and every previous restoration, through every cycle of loss and return that the land has passed through. It does not know about the disruption that preceded this current restoration. It does not compare its progress to any previous episode. It simply does what it does, at the pace it does it, for as long as it takes. There are forests in the mountains of certain temperate regions that have been regrowing for 100 years following logging, and now stand tall enough and dense enough and old enough that the animals that depend on old-growth habitat have begun to return. Creatures that require the specific structures of a mature forest, the hollow trees, the deep shade, the multi-layered canopy, the particular fungi that only grow in soils undisturbed for many decades, these creatures began appearing in forests that, a generation ago, were open hillsides, not because anyone placed them there, but because the forest had become, gradually, sufficiently what it needed to be to support them. The conditions ripened, and the life that required those conditions arrived. This is the nature of ecological restoration. It is not a single event. It is a threshold, approached slowly, crossed quietly, often without announcement. 1 year the conditions are not yet sufficient. The following year, or 5 years later, or 10, they are. And the thing that was absent arrives and takes up residence and begins contributing to the conditions that will eventually allow the next arrival. The grassland rebuilds itself differently than the forest, but with the same patient logic. After a disturbance, the first plants to return are the ones that can tolerate bare soil, full sun, and the absence of established neighbors. They stabilize the surface and begin accumulating organic material. Over years, the grasses that prefer more established soil move in, and the pioneer plants retreat to the edges where bare ground still exists. The grasses deepen their roots, slow the movement of water across the surface, and begin to rebuild the soil community that the original grassland depended on. The whole process takes decades, but it is not random. It follows a sequence that ecologists have traced enough times to recognize its general shape, even when the specific plants and animals involved are different in different places. Nature restores itself not because restoration is a goal, but because living systems are continuously organized by the same pressures and possibilities that shaped them in the first place. The pressures are the chemistry of the soil, the angle of the light, the pattern of rainfall, the temperature of the seasons. The possibilities are the seeds that arrive on the wind, the spores that drift through the air, the roots that spread from undisturbed margins. Given these pressures and these possibilities, and given time, and given the absence of further disruption, a disturbed landscape tends to move, step by step, toward something recognizable as wholeness. The movement is not always straight. There are setbacks, dry years, insect outbreaks, episodes of erosion that undo months of soil building. The line of restoration, if it could be graphed, would not be a smooth upward curve, but something more irregular, more honest, more like the actual shape of time as it moves through natural systems. But the general direction, across the irregularities, across the setbacks and recoveries, is toward elaboration, toward complexity, toward the kind of richness that characterizes a system that has been allowed to continue for a long time. For a season, in the soil that is quietly for a season, in the soil that is quietly rebuilding its invisible community, one organism at a time. The restoration is ongoing in all those places, right now, through these same hours in which you are here, breathing, settling, releasing the hold that the day had on your attention. The world outside doesn't stop its quiet work because the night has come. It simply continues, in the dark, at its own pace, with its own unhurried sense of what is required and what is possible, moving, as it always moves, in the direction of something that could be called, without exaggeration, whole. There is a reason that healing is slow, and it is not a flaw in the design. It would be easy to think of slowness as a limitation, as something that the body or the forest or the river would correct if only it could, if only the right conditions were present, if only the process were more efficient. We live in a world that has organized much of its effort around the idea that faster is better, that the interval between damage and repair is a kind of problem to be solved. And so the slowness of natural healing can feel, from inside that framework, like something to be overcome. But the slowness is not incidental. It is structural. It is part of what makes the restoration genuine rather than merely apparent. And sitting with that idea for a while, letting it move through the mind the way that water moves through soil, slowly finding its own level, reveals something that is worth knowing. Consider what it would mean for a wound to close too quickly. The surface might seal before the deeper layers had organized themselves adequately, before the scaffolding of new tissue had been laid down correctly, before the vessels that need to supply the new tissue had grown into place. The appearance of closure would precede the reality of it. The healed surface would be fragile in ways that were not visible, vulnerable to reopening under pressures that a genuinely healed surface would easily bear. Speed, in this case, would produce something that looked like healing while undermining the conditions that actual healing requires. The body seems to know this. The sequence of events in wound healing is timed in a way that ensures each phase is complete before the next begins in earnest. The clotting that seals the surface is not the same process as the inflammation that clears damaged material, which is not the same process as the proliferation of new cells, which is not the same process as the final remodeling that organizes the new tissue into something strong and aligned. These phases overlap, and their boundaries are not sharp, but the general sequence is consistent, and the time required for each phase is the time that the biology of the process actually needs, not an approximation of it, not an estimate to be improved upon. Nature seems to have arrived at the same understanding through a different route. A forest that regrows too quickly, that fills its canopy before the understory is ready, before the soil community has developed enough to support the trees at maturity, will be a forest that is vulnerable. The trees may grow tall, but their root systems will be shallow, their mycorrhizal networks thin, their ability to survive drought or insect pressure diminished. The appearance of a forest will precede the reality of one. And the difference between appearance and reality in a living system eventually becomes consequential. Genuine restoration requires that each layer of the system develop in proportion to the others. The canopy cannot be more mature than the soil that supports it. The soil cannot sustain organisms that require more complex habitat than the surface plants are yet providing. Everything is calibrated to everything else, and the pace of the whole is set by the pace of the slowest essential part. This is not inefficiency, it is integration. It is the way that complex systems ensure that what they build will last. There is a concept that ecologists sometimes use when describing the recovery of ecosystems. The idea that each stage of recovery creates the conditions for the next stage. The pioneer plants that colonize bare ground after a disturbance do not simply occupy the space. They change it. They add organic material to the soil. They provide shade that moderates the temperature of the surface. They offer structure for insects and small animals that were not present before. And in doing all of this, they make the bare ground into something that the next wave of species can inhabit. They build the stage that their successors will perform on, without knowing that this is what they are doing. This process, which ecologists call succession, is one of the clearest demonstrations of why restoration must be slow. Each stage takes the time it takes, not because the organisms involved are working inefficiently, but because the transformations they need to accomplish, the physical and chemical changes to the soil, the accumulation of structural complexity in the vegetation, the development of the food webs that link different species together, are transformations that cannot be compressed without losing something essential. The time is not empty waiting. The time is the process. And when you understand that, the slowness of natural healing begins to feel less like a limitation and more like a kind of faithfulness to what is real. The body that heals slowly is a body that is doing the work in the right order, at the right depth, with the thoroughness that lasting restoration requires. The forest that takes a century to return to something resembling its former complexity is a forest that is building something genuine, layer by layer, relationship by relationship, organism by organism, in the only way that genuine complexity can be built. Time, in this understanding, is not simply the interval in which healing takes place. Time is one of the materials that healing is made from. There is a particular quality of patience in old things that have recovered from damage. A tree that survived a fire 100 years ago carries the evidence of that fire in its inner rings, a dark line in the record of its growth, a scar on the wood if you could see it. But the rings that came after the dark line are full, healthy, continuous with the rings that came before. The tree did not dwell on the fire year. It simply continued growing, season after season, adding ring after ring, building its trunk outward around the memory of damage without being defined by it. The scar is there, and around the scar, life continued. This is what slow healing looks like across a long span of time. Not the erasure of the difficult episode, but its incorporation into the ongoing structure of the thing. The healed tissue is different from the tissue that was never damaged. The regrown forest is not identical to the one that burned. The riverbank that has rebuilt itself after erosion carries a slightly different profile than it held before. But different does not mean diminished. Often it means more complex, more layered, more richly connected to the history of the place. Healing changes the healed thing, and the change, given enough time, becomes part of what the thing is. Processes involved in repair are, at their most basic level, a series of molecular signals that coordinate the behavior of cells and tissues. The processes involved in repair are, at their core, processes of growth, and growth requires resources. Protein must be synthesized, new vessels must be grown. Cells must be fed as they divide and migrate and lay down new material. All of these requirements must be met from within the same organism that is trying to maintain every other function of its life simultaneously. The liver that is supporting tissue repair is still cleansing the blood. The heart that is circulating the signals of inflammation is still maintaining pressure in every vessel of the body. The immune system that is coordinating the removal of damaged material is still monitoring every surface for the presence of unwanted organisms. The body heals slowly, in part because it heals within the constraints of everything else it is doing. It does not pause its other functions to attend to repair. It incorporates repair into the ongoing activity of a living system that never fully stops. The resources available for healing are the resources not currently required by other pressing needs. They are allocated gradually, proportionally, in response to the signals that the damaged tissue continues to send. This allocation is, in its own way, a kind of intelligence. Not the intelligence of conscious decision-making, but the intelligence of a system that has been refined over a very long time to manage competing demands without collapsing any of them. The body does not overinvest in repair at the expense of function. It does not underinvest in function at the expense of repair. It maintains a balance that, most of the time, serves both needs adequately. The healing proceeds. The living continues. The two are not in competition. They are, in fact, expressions of the same fundamental drive, the drive of living tissue toward its own continuation. And in the night, when the demands of activity are reduced, when the muscles are still, and the digestive system has finished its most intensive work, and the brain has released its grip on the calculations of the day, the balance shifts. More resources become available for the quiet work of restoration. The allocation tips gently toward repair. Not dramatically, not in a way that produces any sensation, but measurably in the biochemistry of the sleeping body, in the levels of certain signals that rise in the dark hours and fall again before the light. This is why the night exists, in a biological sense, at least in part. It is the part of the cycle when the books are balanced, when the maintenance that could not be fully attended to during the active hours is given its portion of the available resources. It is the slow, unhurried repayment of the body's accumulated debt to its own structures. And it is happening right now, in the dark, in the quiet, in the parts of the body that have no voice with which to report their activity. The work is proceeding at the pace it has always proceeded, the pace that the biology of healing has settled into over the long span of time that living things have been healing. Not faster, not slower. Simply at the pace that is adequate to the task. The pace that, given enough nights, given enough quiet, given enough time, produces something that can reasonably be called restored. There is a kind of rest available in knowing that. Not the rest of having finished something, but the rest of not needing to hurry, of being in a process that has its own speed and will maintain that speed without assistance, of being, for these hours, simply the location where the work is taking place, rather than the one responsible for directing it. The body knows the pace. It has always known it. And in the quiet of this night, it is keeping to that pace, faithfully, without urgency, in the way that all genuine restoration has always moved through the world. People have always watched things heal. Long before anyone understood the mechanisms, before anyone had the language for cells or proteins, or the molecular choreography of repair, people observed. They watched wounds close. They watched broken limbs, carefully set and immobilized, gradually become usable again. They watched the sick become well. They watched forests return. They watched rivers recover their clarity after floods. And from all that watching, across many centuries and many different places in the world, certain understandings accumulated. Certain things came to be known, not in the way that laboratory experiments produce knowledge, but in the way that long and careful attention produces it. Slowly, through repetition, through the accumulation of observed pattern. This older knowledge of healing had, at its center, a quality that is easy to overlook when we approach the subject from a modern angle. It was, almost universally, a knowledge organized around time, around patience, around the understanding that certain processes could be supported and encouraged, but could not be accelerated beyond the pace that nature had set for them. The healers of earlier centuries, whatever their specific traditions, whatever the particular plants or preparations they used, whatever the ceremonies or practices that accompanied their work, generally shared this understanding that the healer's role was to create conditions, to remove obstacles, to support the natural movement of the body toward its own restoration. The healing itself, the actual work of repair, was understood to belong to the body. This is not a small thing. It represents a particular relationship between the human practitioner and the natural process, one of attendance rather than control, of accompaniment rather than direction. The healer sat with the process of healing, watched over it, made space for it, protected it from interference. And the process itself, the cellular repair, the knitting of tissue, the gradual return of function, proceeded on its own terms. In ancient Greek medical tradition, there was a concept that carried something like this meaning. The word that has come down to us as crisis referred originally to a turning point in an illness, the moment when the disease reached its peak and the body began, one way or another, to resolve the condition. The physician's task in this understanding was to observe the progression, to identify the turning point when it came, and to support the patient through it. The resolution was not something the physician produced. It was something the body arrived at, given time and the right conditions. The physician was a kind of careful witness to a process that had its own logic and its own momentum. This understanding persisted in various forms through much of the history of medicine, existing alongside more interventionist approaches, sometimes in tension with them, sometimes woven together with them in ways that are difficult to separate in retrospect. The tradition of convalescence, of the deliberate rest that was prescribed after illness or injury, reflects this older understanding. Convalescence was not simply the absence of treatment. It was itself considered a form of treatment, a period in which the body was given the conditions it needed to complete a process that intervention had begun but could not finish. The convalescent was a figure who was understood to be in the middle of something, not yet well, no longer acutely ill. Somewhere in between, in the slow passage from one state to another, and the proper response to this condition was not to hurry it, but to provide it with what it needed. Rest, warmth, gentle food, calm surroundings, time. The understanding was that the body's recovery, like a river finding its course after a flood, could be blocked by too much turbulence and allowed by the removal of obstacles. There is something in that older approach that speaks to a knowledge which long observation produces, and which is easy to forget when attention shifts to the mechanics of the process. The knowledge that the process has integrity, that it is coherent in itself, that it does not need to be managed so much as protected, that what it requires most is simply the conditions in which it can proceed. Different traditions arrived at variations of this understanding from different directions. In the long tradition of Ayurvedic practice, which developed over many centuries in the Indian subcontinent, the body was understood as a system that maintained its own balance through the continuous adjustment of various qualities and forces. Illness was understood as a disruption of this balance, and healing was the process by which the balance was restored. The practitioner's role was to understand the nature of the disruption and to support the movement back toward equilibrium. Many of the practices involved were oriented toward creating the right conditions for this movement: dietary adjustments, periods of rest, the use of specific plants and preparations whose effects were understood over centuries of careful observation, practices designed to reduce what was excessive and restore what was deficient. The underlying orientation was toward the body's own capacity for self-regulation, toward the idea that the movement toward balance was something the body would accomplish if the conditions allowed it. Across the centuries of Chinese medical tradition, a related but differently expressed understanding developed. The body was seen as a system of flows and relationships, and health was the condition in which those flows were unobstructed and those relationships were balanced. Healing involved restoring the conditions of flow, of balance, of appropriate relationship between different aspects of the body's functioning. Time was understood as an essential dimension of this restoration. Certain imbalances that had developed over years required years to fully resolve. The depth of a disruption corresponded to the depth of the recovery required. There was no expectation that ancient imbalances could be quickly resolved. The work was long, and the practitioners and patients who undertook it understood it as long. In the herbal traditions that developed across many cultures and many centuries, there is a body of accumulated observation about the pace and quality of healing in different tissues, different seasons, different conditions. Much of this knowledge was developed by people who spent decades watching the same kinds of healing processes in many different individuals, watching which conditions seemed to support recovery and which seemed to impede it, watching the way that certain plants affected the pace and quality of repair in observable ways. This was not the knowledge of controlled experiments. It was the knowledge of prolonged and careful attention, accumulated across generations, passed from practitioner to practitioner through teaching and practice. What strikes a careful reader of this older knowledge is not primarily the specific remedies or practices, many of which turn out, upon modern investigation, to have real biological effects rooted in the chemistry of the plants involved. What strikes a careful reader is the underlying orientation, the consistent tendency across many different traditions and many different centuries to approach the body as something that knows how to heal, that is organized around its own restoration, that requires from the practitioner primarily the creation of conditions rather than the imposition of solutions. The natural world was observed with the same patient attention. People who worked the land for generations, whose livelihoods depended on understanding how soils and forests and waterways behaved, developed extensive practical knowledge about natural restoration. They knew which plants returned first after a disturbance and what that indicated about the soil's condition. They knew how long a section of forest needed to be left undisturbed before it was suitable for particular uses. They knew which trees were the first to re-establish after fire and which required the shade and soil development that those first trees created. They knew that the river after a flood would be turbid for days, but would clear again, and they understood this clearing as part of the river's own process of settling back into equilibrium. This knowledge was largely observational and largely oral, passed through families and communities rather than through written records, which means that much of it has been lost or fragmented. But what survives points consistently toward the same understanding that the medical traditions also arrived at: that natural systems, whether biological or ecological, tend toward restoration, that the movement toward restoration has its own pace, that this pace cannot be significantly altered from outside, and that the appropriate human relationship to this process is one of patient attention, of creating favorable conditions, of watching over the process without attempting to replace it. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only accumulates through watching the same thing many times over many years. It is a knowledge that is not available to a single observation, no matter how careful. It requires the long view. It requires being present through cycles, through the full span of a process that takes seasons or years to complete. The healers and farmers and land workers who developed the older knowledge of restoration were, by the nature of their work, present through those cycles. They watched the wound close. They watched the bone heal. They watched the field return. They watched the river clear. And watching it many times, in many different conditions, they came to understand it in a way that a single observation could never produce. This is a kind of knowledge that is slow to build, that requires patience to acquire, that accumulates the way that soil accumulates, one layer at a time, over a span of time longer than any single person's attention can fully span. It is the knowledge of people who understood, because their daily experience confirmed it, that the most important processes in the world are the slow ones, that the processes which move too quickly to observe in a single sitting are often the ones that matter most. That time, and attention given freely over time, reveals things that no amount of intensity in a shorter interval can produce. And here, in the quiet of this particular night, there is something of that older patience available, not as a practice, not as something to be done or decided or applied, simply as a quality of the hours themselves. The night has always been the time of the longer rhythms, the slower processes, the work that does not announce itself, and the understanding that this work has always been taking place, that it took place in every generation before this one, that it was watched and noted and slowly understood by people in every century who looked carefully enough at the same processes that are still occurring now. There is something steadying in that continuity. The healing that is taking place right now in every living thing that exists tonight is the same healing that has always taken place. The cells that move through tissue towards the site of repair are following paths that have been followed for longer than memory reaches. The forest that is quietly continuing its century-long recovery from disturbance is following a sequence of restoration that has played out in that same forest, or forests like it, many times before. The river that is slowly reshaping its bank is following the same physics that every river has always followed. None of it is new. All of it is continuing. And in that continuation, there is something that doesn't need a name, but can simply be felt in the quiet, in the dark, in the slow movement of the breath that carries you a little further into the night with each cycle. The dark has always been when the deepest repair takes place. Not because darkness itself causes healing, but because darkness is the condition under which the body has always done its most interior work. The relationship between night and restoration is older than any understanding of it. It is written into the biology of living things at a level so fundamental that it precedes, by an enormous span of time, any conscious awareness of the pattern. The body does not learn to repair itself at night. It simply does, as it has always done, following rhythms that were established long before there were minds to observe them. There is a particular quality to the hours between midnight and the earliest suggestion of morning. A quality that is difficult to describe in terms of what is happening, because what is happening is largely invisible, largely interior, largely beyond the reach of experience. But it can be described in terms of what is not happening. The muscles are not contracting against resistance. The digestive system has finished its most active work. The eyes are closed, releasing the visual cortex from its continuous task of making sense of the world. The ears are still receiving, as they always do, but the brain has lowered the threshold of what it considers worth responding to. The whole organism has moved into a different relationship with its environment, a relationship of reduced engagement, of gentle withdrawal from the surface of things. And in that withdrawal, something else becomes possible. The body in deep sleep is not the same as the body at rest, but awake. The difference is not simply one of degree, of slightly less activity, of slightly more relaxation. It is a difference in kind. Certain processes that are suppressed during waking hours become active. Certain signals that are present but quiet during the day become prominent. Certain repairs that require the absence of the competing demands of movement and sensation and thought proceed during these hours in ways they cannot proceed at any other time. Growth hormone, which despite its name is not primarily a signal for the growth of young bodies, but a signal for the maintenance and repair of all bodies throughout life, rises substantially in the early hours of sleep. It moves through the bloodstream as a kind of instruction, reaching tissues throughout the body with information about the work that needs to be done. Muscles that sustained small tears during the activity of the previous day receive the signal to rebuild. Connective tissue that has been compressed and strained receives the signal to restore its structure. Even bone, which seems so static and so solid, responds to this nightly signal, quietly adjusting its mineral content, reinforcing its internal architecture, attending to the microscopic stresses that the day's movement has produced. This is the body's maintenance window. Not a perfect analogy, because the body's maintenance is not separate from its functioning the way that a machine's maintenance requires it to be taken out of service. The heart does not stop. The lungs do not pause. the immune system does not suspend its surveillance. But within the ongoing life of the organism, the sleeping hours represent a reallocation of resources, a shift in priorities, a turning of attention inward toward the interior work that the waking hours leave undone. The immune system's activity during sleep is particularly interesting to consider, not in its technical details, but in its overall character. The immune system is, among other things, a system of memory and response. It encounters things throughout the day and forms responses to them, recording what it has met and how it dealt with it, adjusting its future responses based on the outcomes of its past ones. Much of the consolidation of this record, the process by which the day's immunological experiences are integrated into the system's ongoing understanding of the world it inhabits, happens during sleep. It is as if the immune system uses the quiet hours to review what it has learned, to file it away properly, to prepare for the following day's encounters with a slightly more refined understanding of what to expect. This is a kind of healing that is harder to see than the closing of a wound or the knitting of a fracture, but it is healing nonetheless. The continuous refinement of the body's ability to maintain itself, to recognize and respond to what belongs and what does not, to remember the challenges it has faced and carry that memory forward into its future responses. It is a restoration of capacity, of readiness, of the subtle calibration that keeps a living system functioning well over the span of a life. The brain, too, does something during sleep that can only be described as a kind of housekeeping, a form of restoration so essential that the consequences of its absence become apparent very quickly. During waking hours, the brain is engaged in continuous activity, processing sensation, forming responses, maintaining attention, generating the stream of thought and perception and decision that constitutes conscious experience. This activity is metabolically expensive. It produces byproducts, molecular waste that accumulates in the spaces between cells as the hours of waking accumulate. During sleep, the channels through which the brain's fluid circulates appear to widen, allowing a more vigorous flow of fluid through the tissue, carrying the accumulated waste of the day's thinking away. The brain washes itself. It clears the residue of consciousness, preparing the space for the next day's activity. This image of the sleeping brain quietly rinsing itself in the dark hours contains something worth resting with. The idea that even thought, even the invisible activity of a mind moving through its day, leaves something behind that requires clearing. That the restoration of mental clarity is not simply a matter of stopping the activity, but of actively processing what the activity has produced. That sleep is not passive, not merely the cessation of waking, but a distinct mode of operation in which the brain does work that it cannot do while conscious. And all of this is happening right now if you are drifting, if the weight of the night is settling into your limbs and the sounds of the room are becoming less distinct. The clearance is beginning. The reallocation is underway. The quiet instructions are moving through the tissue, reaching every cell that has been waiting for the signal that the long work of the day is done and the different work of the night can begin. Runs from the eye to the brain, to the runs from the eye to the brain, to the bloodstream, the presence of the night. And the presence of the night signals the presence of the time for rest and repair. Melatonin, which is suppressed by light and rises in darkness, is part of this signaling chain, part of the mechanism by which the body knows that the night has come and that the rhythms appropriate to night should now be followed. But melatonin is only the most familiar part of a much more extensive conversation between the body and the darkness. A conversation that adjusts dozens of different processes, that shifts the balance of 100 different signals, that quietly reconfigures the priorities of the whole organism in response to the simple fact that the light has gone. This conversation between the body and the dark has been taking place for as long as there have been bodies. It is among the most ancient rhythms of life on Earth. Single-celled organisms that existed billions of years ago showed rhythmic variations in their activity that followed the cycle of light and dark. The response to darkness is not something that complex bodies developed. It is something that all life inherited from its deepest ancestors. A rhythm so fundamental that it persists in living things even when they are isolated from the actual cues of day and night, continuing on its approximately 24-hour cycle purely from internal momentum. You carry that rhythm. It is running right now, in the same way it has run through every night of your life, in the same way it ran through every night of every life that preceded yours, in the long chain of generations that connects you to the very earliest forms of life that noticed the difference between light and dark. The night is not strange to the body. The body has always known what to do with the night. Are still exchanging gases through their leaves, though at a different rate than during the day. The fungi in the soil are still moving minerals through their networks, conducting their slow chemistry in the absence of light, indifferent to the dark because they have never depended on light for their work. Small animals are moving through the undergrowth, occupying the hours that larger, more light-dependent creatures have left vacant. The soil is still breathing, still processing, still engaged in the uninterrupted work of decomposition and transformation that never stops regardless of the position of the sun. Will carry into the morning. There is no will carry into the morning. There is no pause in the river's work. There is no moment when the water decides to rest. It simply moves because moving is what rivers do, because the slope of the land and the pull of the earth are constant regardless of the hour, and the work of carving and depositing and reshaping proceeds through every unobserved moment of every night. This is the quality of the dark that is perhaps most worth carrying into sleep. Not the absence of activity, but the presence of a different kind. The night is not empty. It is full of the processes that prefer the quiet, that do their best work in the absence of the demands that the light brings. The body that is healing, the brain that is clearing, the forest that is slowly knitting its connections through the soil, the river that is patiently working at its banks, all of them in motion, all of them engaged in the particular work of the dark hours, all of them tended by rhythms that have been calibrated over more time than can be meaningfully imagined. And you are among them, not separate from this world of nighttime restoration, but part of it, one more living thing doing what living things do in the dark, your breathing slowing to match the pace of the night, your body finding its way into the deeper rhythms that the waking hours hold at a distance. your mind loosening its grip on the day, releasing the shapes of its concerns back into the formlessness from which the next day will retrieve them, rested and slightly renewed. The dark is not something to be waded through. It is something to be inhabited. A time with its own fullness, its own activity, its own particular form of abundance. The abundance of repair, the abundance of the quiet work that can only be done here, in the unhurried hours between the last light and the first. Rest is not the absence of the body's work. It is the condition under which the body's most essential work becomes possible. And the night, the long, dark, quiet night, is where that work has always lived. Nothing about restoration is in a hurry. This is worth saying again, not because it has not been said, but because the mind has a way of receiving a thing and then quietly setting it aside, returning to its familiar patterns of urgency, its habitual sense that time is passing, and that the passing of time without visible progress is a kind of loss. The mind can hear that healing is slow and understand it intellectually, and still, somewhere beneath the understanding, feel the pull toward wanting it to be faster, toward wishing that the interval between damage and wholeness were shorter than it is. And so it is worth returning to this, gently, without insistence. Nothing about restoration is in a hurry. Not the body's repair, not the forest's return, not the river's patient reshaping of its course, not the soil's slow rebuilding of its invisible community. None of these processes contain anything that resembles urgency. They move at the pace they move because that pace is appropriate to what they are doing, and no amount of wishing them faster would produce a better result. It would only produce a different result, and the difference would be a loss of depth, a loss of thoroughness, a loss of the kind of integrity that only slow work produces. Even just for the duration of a breath, something else moves into the space that urgency occupied. A kind of noticing, a quality of presence with what is actually happening rather than what is wished to be happening. The breath that is already moving, the weight of the body against the surface beneath it, the sounds of the room, near and far, layered over each other in the particular way they layer in this specific place, at this specific hour. Urgency is a kind of narrowing. It focuses attention on the gap between the present situation and the desired one, and in doing so, it removes attention from the present situation itself, from the reality that exists right now, which contains, if attended to, everything that is actually here. The restoring body is here, right now, doing its work. The night is here, with all its qualities of quiet and depth. The breath is here, cycling through its slow rhythm without needing to be faster or slower than it is. The great restorative processes of the natural world do not suffer from urgency because they do not have the kind of consciousness that generates it. A river does not wish it were reshaping its banks more quickly. A forest does not feel impatient with the rate of its own succession. The soil does not compare its current depth of biological activity with some imagined ideal and find itself lacking. These systems simply proceed, governed by the conditions that exist, at the pace those conditions produce, without reference to any preferred alternative. And there is something available in that. Not an instruction to become like a river, not an aspiration to achieve the untroubled patience of a forest, but something more modest and more immediate. Simply the observation that the most enduring restorations in the world have always proceeded without hurry, and that the absence of hurry has not been a disadvantage to them. That the slowness is not a problem to be solved, but a feature of the process, something to be acknowledged and perhaps quietly allowed. In the body, this allowance has a physical dimension. The muscles that are not clenched against urgency are muscles that can be supplied with the blood that repair requires. The breath that is not shortened by the tension of waiting is a breath that moves more oxygen through the system. The nervous system that is not held in readiness for the next demand is a nervous system that can shift toward the mode in which restoration proceeds most easily. The body does not heal faster when it is anxious. It heals more thoroughly when it is quiet. This is not a demand. It is simply an observation about the relationship between the quality of rest and the quality of repair. The night asks nothing. The body asks nothing in these hours beyond the ordinary permission to proceed with the work it knows how to do. The permission is given by the simple act of settling, of letting the weight of the body increase against the surface beneath it, of allowing the breath to find its own pace without adjustment or correction. And the work proceeds. It has been proceeding all along, through every moment of this evening, through every breath since the light went out, through the conversation between the body and the dark that has been running since the first signal of evening reached the chemistry of the blood. It does not need to be initiated. It is already underway. The only question, if it can be called a question, is simply how fully the rest of the mind and body can be released into the night alongside it. The natural world outside offers its own version of this release. The birds that were calling through the afternoon have found their roosts and fallen into their own particular form of sleep, their body temperatures dropping slightly, their metabolisms slowing, their bodies engaged in the same nightly restoration that warm-blooded creatures have performed since before the first ancestor of a modern bird looked up at a sky that did not yet contain anything that would recognize it. The insects that moved through the warm hours have settled. The bees are in their hives, clustered together, maintaining a collective warmth, not sleeping exactly, but resting in the way that bees rest, in a shared quietness that the colony sustains through the dark hours. Even the plants are doing something in the dark that deserves the word rest, not in the sense of inactivity, because plants are never truly inactive, but in the sense of a different mode. During the day, the leaves are engaged in the active chemistry of photosynthesis, converting light into the sugars that feed the plant's growth. At night, that chemistry pauses, and the plant breathes differently, taking in oxygen rather than releasing it, processing the sugars that the day produced, distributing energy through its tissues, doing the quieter metabolic work that the demands of photosynthesis crowd out during the light hours. Even a tree has its version of the night shift. The whole living world, it seems, participates in this rhythm of activity and restoration, of giving and receiving, of the outward engagement of the light hours and the inward work of the dark. It is one of the oldest patterns in life on Earth, older than sleep in the form we recognize it, present in organisms too simple to have anything we would call consciousness, built into the biochemistry of living things at a level so fundamental that it cannot be separated from what living things are. To sleep is to participate in this pattern, to follow the pull of the night into the slower rhythms, the interior work, the quiet processes that do not announce themselves. It is not an achievement, it is a return to the oldest rhythm, the one that was established long before any particular individual arrived to participate in it, and that will continue long after. A rhythm that the body knows, that the cells know, that the whole organism recognizes, in the way that something recognizes a path it has traveled many times before, not through conscious memory, but through something deeper and more reliable. There is a quality that belongs specifically to late night, to the hours when the night has fully arrived and the day feels genuinely distant. A quality of settled depth that is different from the restlessness of early evening or the anticipation of approaching morning. The night at its deepest is simply itself. It is not transitioning from something or toward something. It is fully present as what it is. Dark, quiet, unhurried, full of the ongoing work of the world's restoration, attending to everything that needs attending to, at the pace that everything requires, without preference or exception. In this settled depth, the mind's concerns tend to lose some of their definition. Not because they have been resolved, but because the particular quality of late-night attention does not give them the same purchase that daylight attention does. The worry that seemed sharp an hour ago is still present, perhaps, but its edges are softer. It occupies less of the available space. Other things are present alongside it: the weight of the body, the rhythm of the breath, the distant sound, the quality of the dark itself. And these things dilute the concern without dismissing it, hold it in a larger context, allow it to be part of the night rather than the whole of it. This is something that the long night does to things. It gives them their proper proportion, not small, not dismissed, but appropriately sized in relation to the vastness of the ongoing processes that surround them. The particular difficulty of a particular day, set against the background of a world that has been restoring itself through billions of years of days and nights, finds its level. It remains, but it is held by something much larger than itself. And the body, the patient, unhurrying, quietly industrious body, continues its work through all of this, through the thought and the softening of the thought, through the concern and the loosening of the concern, through every small movement of the mind toward sleep and every small movement away. The body does not wait for the mind to settle before it begins its repair. It has been repairing all along, indifferent to the mind's state, proceeding at its own pace, following its own instructions, attending to its own priorities with the same steady faithfulness that it has brought to this work through every night of every life. Nothing needs to be done. Nothing is required in these hours beyond the simple continuation of the breath, the simple maintenance of the warmth, the simple being of a living body in a dark room at the deep end of the night. The restoration is ongoing. The night is ongoing. The breath moves in and moves out, and in the interval between them, something too quiet to be called anything particular proceeds in the direction it has always moved, at the pace it has always moved, towards the morning that will come in its own time, without being hurried, without being asked. The night continues. It continues in the way that nights have always continued, through the hours that have no name, through the depth that comes after the last thought and before the first awareness of morning. It continues without requiring anything, without asking to be noticed, without marking its own passage in any way that can be felt or measured from inside it. The body is still, or still enough. The breath moves through its slow cycle, one breath following another in the way that water follows water down a gentle slope, each one arriving without effort, each one releasing without decision, the whole sequence unfolding in the quiet, automatic way of things that have found their rhythm and are simply following it. Somewhere in the body, the quiet work continues. It has been continuing through every moment of this night, through all the words that have moved through this darkness, through the slow drift from attention into something softer than attention. The work does not know that you have been listening to it. It does not know that words have been spent describing it. It simply proceeds, as it always proceeds, in the interior dark, in the language of chemistry and signal, and the slow migration of cells through tissue. A wound somewhere is a little more closed than it was this morning. Not noticeably, not in a way that would register if you checked, but by the small amount that one day's repair produces, the invisible increment that accumulates day after day into something that eventually can be seen and felt and called healed. That increment has been added tonight. It has been added quietly, without announcement, in the hours that passed while the mind was elsewhere. Guided by the signals of cells that spend, guided by the signals of cells that spend their whole existence sensing and responding to the pressures that move through the skeleton. The bone tomorrow will be, in ways too fine to measure without instruments, slightly more suited to the life it supports than it was yesterday. This has been happening every night. It will happen every night to come. The brain has been washing itself. The fluid that moves through its tissue has been carrying away the residue of the day's thinking, clearing the spaces between cells, restoring the conditions in which the next day's thought will move a little more cleanly, a little more freely than it might have if the night's work had not been done. All of this is present, right now, in the silence, not as information to be held or processed, simply as the ongoing reality of a living body doing what living bodies do in the dark. And outside, the world continues its own version of this. The forest is still, or still in the way that forests are still at this hour, which is not entirely still but quietly full. The small sounds of the night animals moving through the undergrowth, the occasional settling of a branch, the sound of water, if there is water nearby, moving over stone in the dark, indifferent to the hour, following the slope of the land as it always follows it. The soil beneath the forest is alive in a way that the surface gives no indication of. The fungal threads are still conducting their slow exchange of minerals. The bacteria are still breaking down the organic material that the day's fallen leaves and shed bark have added to the surface. The roots of the trees are still in contact with the network, still receiving and sending the slow chemical messages that connect one tree to another through the ground, This has been happening every night for as long as this forest has been a forest. It happened last night, and the night before, and the night 100 years ago, when the trees that are here now were saplings. And the trees that were saplings then have long since fallen and become part of the soil that the current trees grow from. The continuity of this process, its unbroken extension through time, is one of those things that the mind can touch briefly before it becomes too large to hold. And the river in the dark is the river it has always been in the dark. The current moves. The water that was here a moment ago is already downstream, replaced by water that was upstream a moment ago. The river renewing its own substance continuously while remaining, as a river, the same. The banks are being shaped by forces too gentle to observe in any single moment, but too persistent to resist over the span of seasons and years. The gravel is being sorted by the current, the heavier pieces settling, the lighter ones moving a little further downstream. The whole bed of the river slowly expressing the particular physics of this particular water moving through this particular landscape. Nothing is hurrying. The river doesn't hurry. The forest doesn't hurry. The soil doesn't hurry. The body doesn't hurry. The night does not hurry. It simply continues as nights continue through the hours that belong entirely to themselves, that are not in service of the morning, that do not exist in order to be followed by the day, but simply exist fully and completely as the night. The breath continues. In and out, in the slow rhythm that the body has settled into, the rhythm that doesn't require attention to maintain, that will continue whether the mind attends to it or not, through sleep, through the deepest unconsciousness, through all the hours between now and the first gray suggestion of morning. The breath has been doing this since the beginning. Since the very first breath, which was the beginning of the rhythm, the first instance of the pattern that has repeated, without significant interruption, through every moment of the life that contains it. Tens of thousands of nights, each one beginning with the light going and ending with the light returning, each one containing the same quiet rhythms, the same interior work, the same unobserved repair. This night is one of those nights, ordinary in the way that all nights are ordinary when viewed from inside them, and extraordinary in the way that all nights are extraordinary when the mind is quiet enough to feel what they contain. There is nothing to do with this, nothing to take from it or apply to it or carry forward into tomorrow in any deliberate way. It is simply here, the way that the night is simply here, the way that the breath is simply here, the way that the body is simply here, continuing its quiet faithfulness to the task of being alive, one moment following another in the dark. The sounds of the room are what they are. Soft and close or distant and indistinct, they are part of the particular texture of this particular night, in this particular place, at this particular hour. They will be slightly different tomorrow night, and slightly different the night after, and they have been slightly different every night before this one. But the quality they share, the quality of sounds in a dark room in the deep hours, is the same quality they have always had and will always have. A quality of distance, of the world continuing its business at a remove, of everything outside the breath being, for now, elsewhere. There is only the breath, and beneath the breath, the body, and beneath the body's awareness of itself, the body's work, the deep interior work that has no sensation, no voice, no way of making itself known to the conscious mind. The work that simply proceeds through every layer of tissue, through every sleeping cell, through the whole dark interior of a living thing resting in the dark of a night that is resting around it. The night holds everything: the body, the room, the sounds at the edge of hearing, the thought that was forming a moment ago and has already begun to dissolve into something less defined, something that does not require completion, something that the mind can release without loss. The breath, the dark, the slow and ongoing and completely unhurried movement of the world through another of its nights, tending to everything that needs tending, repairing what is ready to be repaired, continuing what has always continued in the deep and quiet and patient way that restoration has always moved through time. Still and still. And the breath again, softer now, following the night down into the place where description ends, and the simple fact of being alive in the dark is all that remains. And even that, gently, without urgency, begins to loosen its hold. And there is only the continuing, the quiet continuing of everything that has always been continuing through all the dark and all the quiet and all the unhurried hours of every night that has ever been.